So what we're going to talk about today is building products in an agile way, right? And just as a reminder, because I think it's important from a context setting perspective, you had the workshop that Dave Mawhinney did a couple weeks ago on the Lean Startup methodology overall. This, in many ways, kind of builds on that workshop. So if you didn't see that workshop, that's okay. We'll sort of give you the content you need to get caught up with it. Ahead and get those on it's the YouTube channel now, right? On the YouTube channel to actually remind, like, this basically would be the executive summary of Dave's Lean Startup workshop, right? Startup is that you build something. They usually call it an MVP. We'll talk about that in a minute. You measure people's reaction to that MVP. You learn from that measurement, and then that informs what you build next, right? And so this is sort of the impetus or the sort of summary of the Lean Startup. You're just iterate over and over, build, measure, learn, measure, learn. The interesting thing to me about this chart is that it's a little deceiving. I mean, this is my visual too, but it's a little deceiving in the sense that it kind of implies a third of your time is spent building, a third of your time is spent measuring, and a third of your time is spent learning. Right? But if you actually think about the work that you're doing in your startups, right, it actually turns out that that's not the breakdown at all, right? What do you think? Like 80, 15, 5, probably, and probably if you were actually trying to be ideal, it might be like 70, 15, 15, right? So in terms of calendar time, even if you go all in and buy this framework, you're going to spend a lot of your time doing this right up here, right? That's where you're going to spend a lot of your energy and a lot of your time. And so if that's right, I think there's two things that become incredibly important for you. And this is what we're going to try to help you figure out. First of all, you need to get good at picking what you build. Because you have, each time when you get here, you're going to make a significant in what you build next. It's going to take a significant amount of time. And the second thing is, if it's 80% of your effort that goes towards building on the build, measure, learn cycle, then what you want to do is you want to make sure you're actually good at predicting how long it's going to take you to get through each of those build cycles. Because if you can predict how long this will take, and then you can think, okay, I have 3 more of those before I run out of money. Or I have 4 more of those before my spouse says, you know what, like this entrepreneurship thing has been, but you know it's even better, a paycheck or benefits, right? Or maybe 5 more until your mom or your dad tells you, you know what, Johnny, it's time to actually get a job. CMU is not cheap, right? So you only have so many cycles through that, right? And if the reality is that this is where most of the time goes, then predicting how long it takes you to get through each of those cycles becomes incredibly important. And so what we're going to try to do today is help you over the next hour walk away with 2 things. 1, how do you pick what to build? And 2, how do you actually predict how long it's going to take you to build it? And so that's basically the goal of today's workshop. So let's start with that first one. What do you build? So this is Eric's definition. The only thing I've added is this in brackets here of what an MVP is. So this again, it's my format, but it's the exact same text that Dave put up on the slide a few weeks ago. What are you building? You're building the version of a product that allows you to learn as much as you can about customers with as little work as possible, right? So the tension you want to be asking yourself every time you're looking at one of these is, what can I do to learn as much as I can about my customers with as little work as possible? And we call those MVPs, right? If you remember, Dave made a sports joke I don't know a ton about sports, and I don't know anything about baseball, but apparently MVP is the most valuable player on a sporting team. So I think that that's a terrible name for these things. I think it's an awful name for them, actually. And I think that it leads to one of what I think of as 5 really big misconceptions when we think about what we're setting out to build. So when you ask this question, what do you build? I think this definition is really great, but the term MVP becomes really suboptimal because it sends people down the wrong path to think about this. And maybe to set this up, I'll tell a story of some entrepreneurs that I spent time with in Lisbon, Portugal. So none of you know these entrepreneurs is the point. So this was a number of years ago now. This is probably like 7 or 8 years ago. The Kauffman Foundation used to do this thing called Silicon Valley Comes to Europe. And the reality is I'm not from Silicon Valley, but all they really mean is tech entrepreneurs from the US go to Europe. And so it was fun, and like these boondaggles are a lot of fun. So my deal with the Kauffman Foundation was I would do the trip if I could go to Lisbon and one other city because I had friends in Lisbon, so it was like fun to see them as well. So fun. If you've never been to Lisbon, it's a really, really awesome place. So I went there, and auditoriums, but talks like this, and then you do a bunch of office hours. Sit down one-on-one with a handful of entrepreneurs, and like every 20 minutes, a new entrepreneur comes into the room. You talk to them for 20 minutes, and then the next entrepreneur comes in. And it's great because like no matter how good or bad the idea is, it's just a 20-minute commitment. And for the entrepreneur, it's great because no matter how good or bad the person they're meeting with is, it's only a 20-minute conversation. So I was having one of those office hour settings, and these 2 entrepreneurs came in, and these were 2 young guys that had both just gotten married, and their wives were the best or matron or maids of honor in each other's wedding, right? So they'd sort of effectively just gotten married and watched their now wife's best friend plan a wedding as well. So we sit down and they say, okay, here's what we're doing. Here's what our startup idea was. I said, startup idea was? They're like, yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. They said, they said, getting married is broken. And I was like, huh, that's interesting. So I'm thinking like, getting married is broken. So a little context on me. I sold my first startup actually with Dave. We closed that transaction November 30th, 2006. And then I got married December 8th, 2006. So I know nothing about getting married, other than I showed up for the wedding. And it was the best thing I did. Like my wife is incredible. She's much nicer and better in all dimensions than me. But I really was completely uninvolved in the wedding. Like I told my wife, this was early November, I told my wife that I wasn't sure if I would make the rehearsal dinner, but I was quite confident I would make the wedding, thinking that that was going to be like a reassuring thing, like that she was going to be relieved to know that she's not as relieved as I thought she was going to be. But I was really very, very uninvolved. So when they said getting married is broken, the process of getting married, I was like, that's interesting. Tell me about that. And they said, well, here's the problem, Sean. Like our wife would come home, they're a long day, and they would say like, hey, we've got a really important decision to make tonight, right? And they would say like, we need to decide if we're going to put beige or off-white in the wedding invitation. And I said, Sean, the problem with that question is that those are the same colors. Like they're literally the same colors. So the only answer that we could do is like, I don't care, but then this whole fight about it, we don't care about the kids we're gonna have. And so they said like, it's really, really a terrible process to get married. Being married is awesome, getting married is broken. We're gonna build software. We're gonna build software to fix getting married. Now, many of you are chuckling like, well, that's a terrible idea. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. There actually have been lots of startups that have done interesting things around wedding optimization because it turns out a lot of money getting married, and so it's actually not a bad, there are ways to monetize that in interesting ways. I kind of explained I don't know much about getting married. I said, so how did you build software to help the process of getting married? And this is where like the lean startup part of the story comes in. So these guys were really into the lean startup methodology, right? Like super into it. And in fact, they had like brought the book, the lean startup book that Dave showed you last week, and they had like highlighted it and put like tabs in for sections they wanted to read. So I knew that like they would have followed the methodology. So I said, well, what MVP, what was the MVP that you built to test that idea? And they said, well, yeah, that's the problem is we built a landing page and nobody signed up. Weird. So landing page tests, just for those of you who aren't familiar with it, we'll talk about these a little bit more later in the talk. But the idea behind landing page tests is that you typically Google or Facebook ads, you drive prospects to that people sort of opt out, sign up invitation only based on the landing page that you're taking them to. And so so they did that process, and they had two different benefit statements. So one was more around project management, and one was more around picking the right supplies. And they spent thousands of euros driving traffic to that page, and nobody signed up. And here's the thing: I've done at this, I don't know, I've not kept track, but I've probably done 200 landing page tests in the last 20 years. To Dave's point on there's nothing new under the sun, we were doing landing page tests long before Eric Ries wrote a book about landing page tests. Like, this is just things that entrepreneurs did for a long time. So I've done these for a long time. I've never gotten a 0% response rate, ever. This is kind of a joke, but not really. If you could actually get Facebook to let you run this ad, I could build a landing page right now that says, I'm a Somalian prince, please give me your social security number. And if I drove enough of the right demographic traffic to that page, somebody would fill it out and give me their social security number. Like, truly, you just do not get 0% response rates. So they said, well, nobody signed up. I was like, that is weird. And so I said, well, I'm thinking they probably forgot to test the landing page. Like, I bet the submit button doesn't work, right? It's like, well, let's pull up the page and like fill it out, and we'll hit submit and see what we see. So they pull up the page, and as soon as they pull up the page, I actually don't need to test the submit button, because they called it a landing page. But I would say like a much more accurate is landing pages. It's about 4 pages long, black Times New Roman 12-point font on a white background, and there are paragraphs of text around what the system did. And you can't make these details up. I'll never forget this. I say to one of the guys, hey, beige versus off-white. The page is up, and he literally like pushes me out of the way to scroll to like the middle of the 3rd page, where he's got a paragraph that starts with how they use machine learning and genetic algorithms to pick the right color. I mean, it's literally like a paragraph of description that's still never about color picking, right? Like, we can help you pick the right colors. I was like, yeah, I think you're missing the point. And just to emphasize how bad this was, if you got to the last thing, at the bottom of said page, there's like, remember circa 1999 websites? Like the big gray submit button with that was the opt-in form. I say, I think you're missing the point. Remember how you were talking about how your now wife is so concerned about beige versus off-white? He's like, yeah. I said, would she have wanted to use software that looked like this to plan her wedding? And the color drained from his face, like immediately. Like, you could, because what he had done is he had not built a minimally viable product. He'd built a minimally crappy product, right? And that's, I think, actually the first misunderstanding about MVPs. People think way too often, oh, I'm going to build this really crappy thing, and I'm going to put it in front of people, and I'm going to see what I can learn from that. And the problem is that what you learn from putting something really crappy in front of people is that people don't like crappy things, which I actually don't think you need to build an MVP to learn. Like, how many of you think, you know what I love doing every day? Using really ugly software that's hard to use, right? So maybe in a B2B setting where your boss makes you use the software, you can sometimes get people to do that. But I've got 20 CIOs from different groups of Optum upstairs right now for a workshop we're doing. And they just spent the entire morning telling me how hard it is to get their business users to use systems that aren't designed well, right? Everybody, the table stakes are quite high for actually using these types of technologies across the board in B2B and B2C. So what you actually want to build is not a minimally viable product. What you actually want to build is what I call minimally awesome products. Because what you want to do is you want to say, what's the least amount of stuff that I can build in an awesome way that allows me to learn as much about my customers as possible? Which, by the way, that is Eric's definition of MVP. I just think he chose poorly on the word he came up with to describe that. The other thing that I love about calling them minimally awesome products is the acronym actually makes sense now, right? So there is nothing about like all-stars on a baseball or basketball team that to do with MVPs, but it is a map, right? What you're doing when you build these things is you're mapping out where you're heading, right? So the acronym actually makes sense. It's like, okay, where am I going? And here's how that's relevant to you. You don't actually have to walk in and say, hey, I need to raise $250,000 to build an MVP. No. That implies that you're going to go through that build, measure, learn cycle exactly one time for $250,000, right? Each time through, you're having a little better map of where you're heading because you're learning a little bit more about where you're going, right? So it's not a destination, it's actually a map. You'll get the copy of these slides afterwards, so don't worry about all the text here. But what I like to encourage entrepreneurs to do is think about this, where each time you go through one of these build, measure, learn cycles, you answer the following 4 questions, like, what are you building? And which learn cycle am I on? How is the customer going to interact with that? What do I hope to learn from that? And then how much is it going to cost me to build? And the idea is that in a perfect world, as you move along here, it gets slightly more expensive. The MAPs get slightly more interesting because you're able to have better and better customer interaction. But what you do here informs what you do here, which informs what you do here, right? That's really what you're trying to do. It's not do this one time through. It's iterate on it and get there. This leads to another thing. People tell me all the time, like, well, this is the MVP that I want to build. And I'm like, okay, well, what are you going to learn from that? There are wrong answers to some questions. There is a wrong answer to the, what am I hoping to learn from the MVP? The wrong answer to what you're hoping to learn from the MVP or MAP is, can I build what I have in mind? Remember, that's not an MVP, right? Just the fact it's like, oh, I can build what I have in mind, that's irrelevant, right? What you're trying to do is validate or invalidate key hypotheses about your business. And again, if you remember Dave's workshop a couple of weeks ago, the key hypotheses about most startups are, does anybody care about what I'm building? Because remember, most startups fail because they build something that nobody wants, right? That's not most startups fail because they couldn't build what they set out to build. The last 2 are just sort of simpler ones, but it doesn't have to be a product at all. We're going to talk about some MAPs that aren't products at all. Things like storyboards, interviews, things like that. And then this is a big one at Carnegie Mellon. It's not always a landing page. So is it always a landing page? No, it's not always a landing page. We love landing pages here. I think it has something to do with there are 2 things that people at CMU love about landing pages. Number 1, I'm giving you the nicer one first. They give you a lot of data. People like data here, right? It's like, oh man, I can run this landing page. I can have 3,000 people respond, and then I can slice those 3,000 responses tons of different ways. Maybe that's relevant for you, maybe it's not. But we love that, and I think it draws us to doing it. It's quantitative data. It's not this soft qualitative stuff. It's quantitative data. We're good at that kind of data here. And then the other reason that they love it, and this is important as well, is because you don't have to go talk to anybody, right? Remember what we talked, this is the last remember from Dave's talk, but remember where the facts are about innovation? The facts about innovation are outside the building, even in really nice buildings like this. This is a really great building. And this is like the best space and a really great, like you're right now in the nicest space, in the nicest building on awesome. We used to be in a terrible Oh, unless target customers are other student entrepreneurs working on their startup, there's not a ton of customer discovery that you can do right here. Now, you can use the fact that you're in the nicest building, in the nicest space, in the nicest building on campus, because people like to come visit you here. So that can be incredibly effective, right? You can talk to Alex and he'll get you a conference room and you can actually bring your customers in here, and that's cool and exciting and fun for them. So there are ways to take advantage of the fact that the entrepreneurship is in the nicest space, in the conference room, thinking about what your customers want, not helpful for you at all. And similarly, just running a big landing page test and then slicing data over and over again, sometimes that's helpful, but not near as often as I think we often here think it is. Okay, so what do you build? Sometimes you do build a landing page, but there are other things you can build as well. You can do storyboards, demo videos, Wizard of Oz. I'm going to walk through each of these in a minute, but this is really are just some examples, and this is not a prescriptive order. I met with an entrepreneur a couple years ago after I did this workshop, and she was like, so I did the storyboard and I did the landing page, but I really don't know how to do a demo video for my startup, as if this is like a sequence. Like, let me do this, and then I'm going to do no, these are just 4 random ideas. Think of these as like, hey, these are conversation starters. So storyboards. What's a storyboard? Storyboard's simple. It's just a sketch that shows what's the customer doing right before they use your product, what are they doing right while they use your product, and what are they doing right after they're done using your product, right? So I hope you don't have this idea. But let's say you have an idea for an app that lets you take pictures on your phone, do something to them, and then share them. We'll call it Tartangram. And you can make them red. Yeah, it's a bad idea. That's the whole idea. Some of you are looking at me like, that's a terrible idea. Exactly. I feel pretty confident that's nobody's idea, so that makes this easier, right? So your storyboard then would be the before is not like, what's the world like before Tartangram is out there? The before is like, oh, I see something that I want to take a picture of. Oh, they're playing soccer at Central Catholic right now. I want to take a picture of that. That's the before. The during is like, I take out my phone. I open the app. I take the picture, and then I share it. And then the after is like, my friends tell me what a great picture that is, and I feel better about myself, right? So before, during, and after. Some of you like want to leave the talk right now. Like, I can't believe he just made fun of pictures. Sorry, but the point is before, during, and after, right? And the idea here is that there are 3 really great benefits to actually taking storyboards out, showing it to customers, and getting their feedback on it. And those are the following. First of all, it's a mirror. You're actually showing what you have in mind to a customer and saying, is this a good reflection of what you imagine? And here's why that's important. So I'm a big fan of doing interviews. Like, I don't do the interview workshop here at Schwartz, but I know we do a great stuff on how to do customer interviews here. I teach it in my class. If you've taken any of my entrepreneurship courses, you know to be good at interviewing. There is a problem with interviews, though. People think the right thing to tell you is that your idea is good. They think that's nice. And in America, the only thing that we think that's more important than being nice in general is not lying, right? We're taught it from a very young age. Like, remember, cut down the apple tree, blah, 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 right? So we don't want to lie. Here's the nice thing about storyboards. When you hold something up and say, hey, is this a good reflection of you? The desire not to lie is stronger than the desire to be nice. And so you will get more frank feedback. I think doing interviews earlier in the process is brilliant, but this becomes a great next step. The next thing is, because it looks rough, because storyboards inherently look like just rough outlines, people feel more comfortable telling you about the problems with your idea. I've actually seen this happen a couple times in startups I've worked with over the last couple of years, where so we'd show them the finished product and they'd say like nice things about it, but then we would leave and they wouldn't use it at all. And then we had different people, so could be the people, but I don't think so, but similar conversations with the same types of people, although different individuals, where we showed them a storyboard. And all of a sudden they started saying, well, that's not as helpful. This is helpful. And I think what happens is when you show someone a finished product, they think like, oh my gosh, especially you guys, oh my gosh, this is a really smart Carnegie Mellon student who's worked on this for a long time. You know what I should tell him? I should tell him all the good things about that idea. When you show them a storyboard, it's like, oh man, they're like a couple weeks into this. I could help them come up with an even better idea because it's not finished yet, right? So you get more honest feedback because it's a storyboard. And the third one is, I've yet, and I'm sure it's going to happen at some point, but I've yet to meet an entrepreneur in my office who's fallen in love with his storyboard. I cannot make the same statement about a product. I've met a lot of entrepreneurs who've fallen in love with their product, right? So doing this early in the process in general is really helpful. But if you're not getting high quality feedback later, it's often a great thing to go back and revisit later as well. Here's a great example. So one of the other things that I do here besides teaching a bunch of entrepreneurship classes is I also run our corporate startup lab, which is this program where we actually help large companies do startups inside the large companies. That's why Optum's upstairs today. I'm increasingly fascinated by this topic of how do large companies do startup-like innovation. Anna's in the back of the room. She works at Numo, which is PNC's version of kind of a corporate startup in a pretty cool place. So this is a story from a number of years ago, but I love this story and I use it all the time. It is a corporate startup, but I think very, very applicable to people doing traditional entrepreneurship as well. So years ago, right, this thing came out called the iPhone. And if you remember when the iPhone came out, if you opened up any popular, article, like the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Business Review, whatever, there were these sort of missives about, hey, you got to have an app strategy. What's your company's app strategy? Today, it wouldn't be app strategy. Today, it might be like, what's your big data strategy or your machine learning and AI strategy? But back then, this was like, what's your app strategy? And so I'm speculating a little bit here, but my intuition from talking to these guys talk is that somebody on the TurboTax team was like, hey, what's our app strategy? And, that probably got to the CEO. He's like, yeah, we need an app strategy. We got to have one of those. The problem with an app strategy for tax software is doing taxes on this is pretty terrible. I think the only thing worse than doing taxes on that would be doing taxes on this, right? Because it's actually pretty correlated. Like the smaller the screen, the more painful it would be to do it. So it's an awful idea. An app strategy for tax software. That's a terrible idea. But to give these guys credit, they went out with a storyboard and they started talking to people about like, hey, we're thinking about building an app for TurboTax. And I bet you, if they'd gone out and actually showed people a finished TurboTax app, people would have tried to tell them the good things about a TurboTax app. But because it was just a storyboard, people were like, well, you know what? That's not really, I'm not like doing the dishes and thinking like, what I should do tonight, I should do my taxes. Well, let me get my iPhone out and I'll do my taxes on that. And I'm certainly not going to try to file my taxes on my iPhone. But as they were walking them through what they were doing, they said, you know what though, that middle step where you talked about how you could take pictures of your W-2 statements and all the charitable gifts, like that actually seems pretty helpful. And all of a sudden, the revelation became like, hey, doing taxes by yourself on this is terrible. Doing taxes, this is still terrible, but it's slightly less terrible, is doing taxes with both these things together, right? And so that became the app that they ended up building. And it became actually a very differentiated feature for TurboTax for a year, which is really important because if you think about taxes, you basically have a few months a year that you sell all your tax software, right? Because people tend to file their taxes one time a year. So it was a really helpful kind of storyboard example. Landing pages. I talked about the wedding planning software earlier. The thing that, beyond just making it not suck, that I would say is important about landing pages is there's a bunch of things that you want to look at your landing page when you're done. And you want to say like, okay, the landing page test I'm doing, are all 6 of these things true? So first of all, are you talking about it from your perspective or the user's perspective, right? And I mean, you can get an entire degree here at Carnegie Mellon on that bullet. That's not what we're trying to do here in a hour workshop. The point simply is make sure that you're framing it from the perspective of the people who are trying to buy this, not from your perspective. Is it clear and concise, right? So no 4-page landing pages. Is it conversion focused? So you should be able to do exactly one thing on that page when you get there. I see so many landing page tests where they put the landing page like on their standard web template. And then what ends up happening is they drive people to that page and then people start clicking around to other parts of the site. So it's like, you get to mystartup.com/landing page, and then across the top, you've got the whole navigation for mystartup.com. And so they click to the home page and they click over to the blog. And all of a sudden, you actually don't know if they converted or not because they've gotten lost somewhere else on your site. So you'll do exactly one thing till you opt in. That's just fill out the dang form. Once you fill out the form, this becomes important. Once you fill out the form, it's really important that you let someone do something after filling out the form. And what I've come to realize is, in almost every setting, a really nice thing to do after they fill out the form is invite them to share what they just opted into with their friends. And then you measure both opt-ins and shares, because what you'll find is sometimes the two things you're testing have very, very similar conversion rates, but people don't feel similarly strong about both of them. And sharing becomes a nice proxy for how strong you feel about them. So the example I talked about from Portugal, the system wasn't broken, but the number of times I've sat down with an entrepreneur and they have had something broken in their system is kind of tragic. It's really inexpensive to just pay one of these tools to actually just do the measurement for you, like Optimizely, that kind of stuff. We also have, what's the mobile startup, that mobile landing page that started by the alums? I'm looking at my two Schwartz people. And so ask Dave, there is actually, and they've raised like $50 million. There is a group of CMU guys in Seattle who've built mobile Optimizely, basically, and it works really well. And then make sure it's consistent. The only thing that you want to be different about the two landing pages is what you're testing. And that sounds obvious, but it's actually really easy to make some other things different about the two pages and have people react differently depending on which page they're on. So I'll give you an example from one of the startups that I was working on for a little while. This idea didn't go anywhere for a variety of reasons, but I had an idea for a little while about building a mobile app that you would prepay for your gas to lock in the price that gas cost you, right? And you could basically use fuel op to guarantee that the price. And so, yeah, it's like for an average American, fuel for their vehicle becomes the most important expense that's variable on their budget, right? So certainly, like, housing is more expensive than fuel, but housing is pretty consistent. Insurance is more expensive than fuel, but insurance is pretty consistent. Even food, it's a pretty forecastable expense. But if you think about what fuel costs you in the winter and the summer, like, it's meaningfully different for people, and for people who are really committed to budgeting, that becomes a challenge. So we thought, hey, it would be cool, like, you prepay for the fuel, and then just like you do with your mortgage or your insurance, like, this gas will cost me to fill up my SUV for the month. So we thought it was a really great idea. Turned out it was a terrible idea for a variety of reasons I can talk about later. What's relevant here is the first landing page test that we did. So we actually we had two different benefit statements and built two different landing pages. We drove people to those two different pages, significantly higher conversion rate on one. And so we're thinking like, oh, cool, we figured out which benefit people care about more. Well, the problem was, what we didn't realize is we actually had the like stock photography we had used for the two different landing pages was different, because we felt like neither stock image worked well for the other landing page. What we did was driven by the stock photo, not the text on the page. And because we swapped the images at one, and we're like, oh shoot, one of those images is just higher converting than the other. You can dramatically change conversion in a button from page. It dramatically swing what you're going to see in terms of conversion rates there. So you want to be kind of maniacal about consistent outside of the things that you're doing. I'm not going to play this, but Allison will send around the slides. This is kind of a classic example of the demo video. So when Drew was starting Dropbox, one of the challenges he had, he would tell people about Dropbox. I'm familiar with that. Because like Yahoo had a service to upload files and share them, right? And so he had to figure out how to actually show people what he had in mind. So he used Camtasia to start and stop video recording over and over again to actually get people to kind of interact with the Dropbox system. So now, and the video was kind of funny. He posted it on Reddit. He did there's a bunch of kind of spoofs in it to get people to pay attention to it. Now, here's a question for you guys. Remember, for every MAP, what do you want to do? You want to figure out what you're testing and how the customer will interact with it. What are you testing and how does the customer interact with a demo video like this? Not all at once, yeah.
Are they watching the whole thing?
I mean, it's unlikely, and I actually don't think that that's that predictive, unfortunately, because I think that's more of a prediction of how good the video is than how good your idea is. But you could track that, yeah.
Are they doing the thing in the video?
So what do you mean by doing the thing in the video?
Like if there's a video for Dropbox, like you click here to get an account, click here to set.
So typically, that's a great idea, but typically you do these before you have the product done. So there's no ability to sign up. Yeah. That's pretty close. He was actually tracking number of people who sent him this email. And it's actually the beginning of the experiment, not the end of the experiment. So the experiment was, if you want to be added to this list, send me an email at getdropbox.com. He had tons and tons of people, but he had 5,000 people send him an email. And then he was able to actually learn from the interaction between the people and that. So the point is, this was just the beginning of the customer interaction, not the end of it. So that's demo videos. The last is sometimes people call these manual. Have an idea, and we have lots of these ideas at Carnegie Mellon today, to do something in a very automated fashion, right? So you put some input in, some magical AI and ML happens, and something awesome comes out the other end, right? So you upload a document, or let's actually use John's idea because he was brave and actually shared his idea at the Connects workshop. So you go to a site and you say, hey, I want to find cheap beer on the south side, and through his algorithm and the data that he has, he tells you where the cheapest beer is there. And you can get that again, where, John? Beerhere.net. I know many of you don't drink at all, but for the small percentage of you who enjoy drinking beer, you can try that out. You can try that out now. So you can do this, right? You can build systems to do that workflow that we just saw. You can also have the way that it works is you fill out a form. That form emails John. John does some research on really quickly, and 10 minutes later emails you back the cheapest place to get beer. Right? Now, you wouldn't want to do that forever. Like your long-term product vision is not a bunch of John sitting, going to google.com and searching. But here's the thing that's interesting about doing that. If you start doing something like this manually, you actually can learn a lot about what you want to build. Because oftentimes, this workflow that you have in mind ends up being different than what it actually is when you start actually having customers interact with it. Right, so John might think like, oh, the way I'm going to help recommend beer is like this. But it turns out through doing this manually for a couple of weeks, all of a sudden he realizes like, you know what? Really what people want is, four recommendations within a quarter mile of each other or whatever the case may be. Right, so you can learn a lot doing the work manually before you automate it. And then it turns out it makes the process of automating it much, much simpler. You see this in a ton of the AI startups right here. So Mark's in the back of the room. who did robotics, right, which kind of inspect roads. People have been inspecting roads long before we sent a bunch of roboticists to figure out how to inspect roads well. I mean, Mark does it better in so many ways, but people had been doing this for a long, long time, right? And so what he was able to do is come back behind and say, okay, let's use smart adaptive systems to automate that process, right? But he'd already sort of seen the manual process. Many times, this is new ideas and new things that we're trying to come up with, right? And so you have to sort of do the manual work yourself just for a little bit of time to then figure out what you're going to automate. Does that make sense? Okay, so those were meant, again, as just a number of like, hey, here's some examples of the things you might build. Now, in just a couple minutes, what I want to finish up on is, okay, so if that's what you build, right? That was the first of the two things we were trying to figure out. The second part of this was, well, how long is it going to take you to build it? Because remember, people measure time in calendar months, but you as an entrepreneur measure time in build, measure, learn cycles. The problem is you can't tell your spouse, oh, I need 3 more cycles before I go. What we found is that it ends up becoming a really helpful way to sort of manage these projects. And then we're going to talk for just a minute about Scrum, and not Scrum as a development technique, but Scrum as a management layer to sort of provide visibility into how much. But first of all, what do we mean by Agile? The problem with the word Agile is that business people have completely ruined it. See, Agile actually used to mean something. In 2001, a bunch of folks went to a ski lodge and wrote the Agile manifesto, and they meant something very specific by the term Agile. But the problem was that a bunch of CEOs heard about this Agile manifesto, and they're like, you know what? I want to move fast too. And so they just started using Agile to mean fast, right? And I see this now because like in my day job as a VC, I'll get pitched Agile for blank industry all the time. Like, I want to do Agile human resources. I don't know what that means. I want to do Agile accounting. I'm pretty sure that's illegal. That's how you end up being WeWork, right? WeWork is Agile accounting. You don't want to be an Agile accountant. What do we mean by Agile in this workshop? What we mean is you value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, right? You're not saying you don't value processes and tools, but the people and the interactions between them is more important. Working products are more important than documentation. Collaborating with your customers becomes more important than negotiating your contracts. And responding to change becomes more important than following a plan. And this last one is incredibly important in a startup because you're going to be wrong than you're right, right? And so the key question becomes, okay, if I'm using this philosophy, and this, by the way, this text, this is the entirety of the Agile Manifesto. You just read the Agile Manifesto. Like, it was not complicated, but it turns out when you think about complex engineering projects, when you act more like teal than you do the white, the projects just tend to go better, right? That was the original idea. So you're going to be wrong more than you're right. You got to figure out how quickly can you iterate and how long is it going to take you. And what we found is that Scrum becomes a really helpful wrapper around however you're doing it, because it gives you this sort of measurement to actually figure out the time it's going to take you. And the idea behind Scrum is pretty simple, right? You have a list of things that you need to get done. You take them off in chunks. The list of things you need to get done, you call the product backlog. You take them off in chunks. You do them in, roughly 2-week to 4-week blocks of time. Those are called sprints. You work on all those for those, in this case up here on the chart, 30 days. Every day you ask yourself, what have I done since the last time we met? What am I planning to do before we meet again? And what do I need help, or what's getting in the way? What's blocking me? You don't often need to do a daily Scrum when you're right at the beginning of your project, but I will tell you, at least a few times a week, having everybody on the team answer this what's getting in the way question becomes really helpful. Because often there are obvious things that if you could fix for people, they'd be far, far more productive for you. So you do that kind of on a regular cadence. At the end of the sprint, you ship it, and you see kind of how it's going. The idea here, and the reason that Scrum's so helpful, and the reason it helps you predict how long it's going to take you, is this one concept, which is And the idea behind velocity is that all of your estimates are always looking. So each day on this 30 days, you're saying, okay, this thing I'm working on, how much time do I think it's going to take me between now and getting it finished? Right? You're not worried about how long it took you before. You're just always updating your estimates forward looking. And then you're summing up all of your estimates, and the in aggregate decrease in those estimates is what's called the velocity. And what you're going to find is that over time, your estimates start to decrease, across a given 30-day, sprint, a very consistent amount of time. Now, it'll be less than the hours you estimate, right? So most people think like, oh, I can get this done in 8 hours, and it takes them 16 hours. But they're wrong basically the same amount every time. Your estimates are sort of off a consistent amount. And so then you can look at, once you figure that out, you sort of the rate of decrease in estimates, which will be far less than the number of hours people are working. And you can get a time to say, okay, I know that I can burn, I can get down about 200 hours of work every 30 days. And what you'll realize is like, oh man, if I think I have 600 hours of work left, I've got 3 months of work left. Even if you've got 10 people working, it doesn't matter. Like, your estimates decrease for the same team roughly the same amount of time as they go on. Is that making sense? Some of you are looking at me like I have no idea what you're saying. Is there a question that you could ask that would be helpful clarifying, or are you just like ready to get on to class? Okay. So velocity and burn down, right? The whole concept here, though, is that you're sort of forward-looking, doing that, and that's how you answer this question, how long do I have? And then you can actually draw really great charts, right? So this is like the first day of the sprint, how much total time, right? Second day, third day. Sometimes you don't burn down at all. Sometimes you burn up, because sometimes you think like, hey, I thought this was going to be a pretty easy task to work on. It turns out it's more complicated than I thought. So that's fine. But what you can start to see is like, oh man, this would have been like the 5th through the 8th day. Like, oh shoot, I'm not actually burning down at all. I'm not going to get this done in the amount of time that I thought. You also start to quickly figure out like, well, how many hours should I pull off the backlog every time I do one of these? And then you get better and better at predicting this. And so the concept here is you can then say, okay, I know this is how much I can get done in one build, measure, learn. I know how many more build, measure, learns I have before I run out of money, time, whatever. And it becomes this sort of helpful wrapper to predict the future. So again, just to kind of summarize, and then we'll open up for questions for a couple of minutes. Right, we're trying to do 2 things today. And this is not, by the way, what you need to ask questions about. You can ask questions on whatever you want. But we're trying to do 2 things today. Answer 1, the question, okay, what do we build? So what's the MVP? We gave you 4 examples of that. And then 2, talk about how to build it, right? And the punchline there is we think Scrum becomes a really helpful wrapper to make your timing more predictive. So with that, I think we've got 10 minutes for questions, or you guys can get on with your day, which is fine too. So any questions? Yeah.
Going back to storyboards.
Yeah.
I wonder how much of somebody seeing the storyboard versus seeing an actual product, is there a bias for the customer when you see a real product, something you would be paying for, versus storyboard is not something you would feel would be paid for? Would that cause a bias?
I think it can. I also just think, so I think that can cause a bias. I also think it feels like a much more defined thing. Like a finished product, or closer to finished product, feels sort of definitionally finished, right? And so people are just going to kind of react to that differently than here's an idea that I have. Yeah, John?
So you talk about the difference between having a minimum viable product and a minimum awesome product.
Yeah.
Should you still be embarrassed by your first minimum awesome product?
Yeah, so what you should be embarrassed by, so the origin of that quote is from Reid Hoffman. There's a great story, but it basically would take all of our time if I told it to you. But there's a great story of 5 features that LinkedIn wanted to build for their, this is pre-lean startup, but for their MVP or their MAP. And after 4 of them were done, they ended up shipping the product, worried that people were going to be like, oh, LinkedIn doesn't know how to build software, because it was so embarrassingly raw. the interesting thing about that story is that when LinkedIn went public, they still hadn't built the 5th product, but it was still on their backlog, right? And so then Reed has this famous quip where he tells that story and he says, so you need to be embarrassed by the first product. My argument is you need to be embarrassed by the product in the sense that you need to be embarrassed that there's a bunch of things that feel obvious that you should build that you haven't yet built. You don't want to be embarrassed in terms of like, wow, this is a crappy product, right? So people often say, like, well, lean startup stuff doesn't work. Think iPhone. Do you remember the first iPhone? Like the first iPhone, you couldn't copy and paste. The first iPhone didn't have apps in it, right? There were a bunch of like embarrassingly obvious things that were missing from the first iPhone. But the point was it was minimum, so there were things that were missing, but the things that it did really awesome, right? And that's the balance you're trying to strike. And so I think that's where the embarrassment kind of piece comes from. Good question, though. Anything else? Yeah.
So one issue that I had at the last company that I was working at was regarding they were running Agile with the Scrum process, but it was not really working out very well. So we would go multiple months without like shipping any software because like the team wasn't estimating correctly, it wasn't taking into account all of the different issues that were coming up. So I guess it's just like how do you recommend handling accountability in those situations and not just kind of like throwing it on your hands and saying, well, we learned something new, so of course it's going to take us longer. Like how do you keep the team accountable?
Yeah, I mean, so that doesn't sound agile to me. What made it feel agile to you?
We were running 2-week sprints,
But you weren't shipping anything at the end of the sprints.
yeah. So like our board never charges thing is
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, I mean, to me, it sounds like changes need to happen. Like if I don't know enough about the organization. I'm not saying this about. I think there's different types of failure. That feels like a failure where like you need to think about like, was there something wrong with our strategy or is there something wrong with the team that we've assembled? Because that doesn't feel like a good type of failure, right? There's good types of failure which are like, oh, I have this crazy hypothesis. I do some work and I realize it's not true, right? So I go through one of those build, measure, learn cycles and I invalidate one of my key hypotheses and I need to revisit them. That's like smart work, right? There's also like lazy failures, which are like you don't actually do the work that you need to do, like having a flat burn down chart. And bluntly, like I think you got to think about the team and the strategy at that point, if that's what you're looking at. So that's probably not what you're hoping to hear, but that was my honest, quick reaction to that. And I don't know your company, that may not be fair. Yeah.
I'd like to hear your take on creating intentional friction in that initial landing page. So in the example you gave of Dropbox, it seems like he used a particularly high friction way of getting conversions, right? Where like the person signing up had to go through manual email to get access, quote unquote.
Right.
But I mean, like, just like
Friction on the sign up as a way to, like the original Gmail where it was hard to get an invite.
because like creating that friction can help you identify that there's a really strong need for something to fill in the gap where you're trying to solve. But at the same time, like with lower barriers, you can probably just like
Yeah, so I think it's all about what the customer interaction is that you're trying to drive towards and what you're trying to validate, right? So the feedback that Drew got was not really people signing up, right? It was the email with those people after they signed up. So you could almost think about everything as noise till they sent him an email to beta@getdropbox.com, right? Now, which I think I think that interaction back and forth is incredibly helpful to figure out, do you have product market fit or not? And everything in the lean startup part of these Connects workshops are all about idea to product market fit, right? That's kind of what the workshops are all about, right? I'm very interested in product market. Literally did write a book on it called The Science of Growth. I think that post product market fit, there's a lot of interesting techniques you can do to try to catalyze growth. And I think things like, restricting the number of Gmail invites and putting artificial constraints in to sort of change the dynamics there become really important post product market fit. But as it relates to these techniques, landing pages, videos, whatever, I think I wouldn't do any of that unless I feel like it helps me learn more about customers and what their problems are for getting to product market fit. All right, I think we're kind of out of time. So I know some of you guys have to get to class right at 1:30, so I'll call it here. But it was really great to see you guys, and thanks so much for your time.